Hey, everybody, this is Bob Brooks, host of the Prudent Money Radio Show. We have been doing these intros to the podcast, and I apologize if you hear construction in the background. They obviously know that 3 to 3:30 is off, but 3:30 they can start the construction up. But we're not finished. I just want to talk a little bit about what you're going to hear today. You're going to hear some great advice and information from Tony Joe about the car overheating, what to do, what steps to take, when is it the point that you've got to pull over, and Tony Joe talks through all this. I have Tony Joe here with me, and I said, this is the point that we do this because we can say anything that, well, within reason, that, that we can't say on nonprofit Christian radio. The nonprofit is the key because we're not supposed to do any advertising or anything like that. But then I got to thinking, I said to myself, Bob, is that really smart to do this with Tony Joe here? Because it's taken you 20 something years to get this filter built up, and now you're saying let go of the filter.
33 years this year.
33 years.
Well, including with Don.
Oh, including with Don. Okay.
So I don't know what to say other than training camp begins in 5 days.
You see, nobody wants to hear that on the program, but maybe some our podcast listeners would like to hear that. But thank you so much for pulling us up and including us in your life and the podcast. And if you sign up for the Prudent Money e-letter, you get a summary of all the podcasts for the week, and you can pick and choose what makes the most sense. Tony Joe, as our one guy we think the world of that used to have this radio show, Don Spear used to always say, final thoughts. Let's hope you don't have any. You can say no.
It's hot, and I know a cat, and his name is Little Man, and every day I go, Little Man, you know what today is? It's the dog days of summer. And he goes, meow, like smart mouths me. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay. Well, hey, we hope everybody has a great weekend and enjoy the show. If I can ever do anything for you, info@prudentmoney.com. Please shoot me an email, and we'll take care of you. That's all at the website, prudentmoney.com.
Radio, KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth, and KYJC, Commerce. Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, what to do with an overheating car, part 2. Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for the special Car Corner edition of Prudent Money. Good afternoon, this is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the special Car Corner edition of Prudent Money. Tony Joe's here with me, as he is every Friday, to take your Car Corner questions. Number to call is 1-877-913-5357. If you've got a question for me, I want to invite you to go to prudentmoney.com. Send that question into the the Q&A link at the top of the page, and I'll get you taken care of. That's all at the website, prudentmoney.com. 1-877-913-5357. Tony Joe, how's it going today?
Oh, it's going just fine, Bob. A little warmer than I'd like it to be. Think you could turn the thermostat down a couple of degrees?
Yeah, I actually got out today at lunch, and it was warm.
You know, I was on the way over here, just real quick, I'll make this fast, thinking about something.
Yeah.
That happened to me in my ute. My first summer ever in Texas was 1980.
Yeah.
Now, let me just point out something. It was the longest streak of over 100-degree days that we've ever had. Now, we came close in 2011, but the thing that I want to point out is it was actual temperature that I looked it up. 26 and 27 July was 113 each day. We've never seen that since. We've never had a streak of 100-degree days longer than the one we had in 1980. And I want to also remind the people that were there, may remember this, but it hit, you know what broke the streak, Bob, was it hit 99 one day. And then it went right back up to 104, 105.
Yeah, if you're going to go through that, you want the T-shirt that says, I went through 200 days.
Well, see, the thing is, it broke the streak at 42 days.
Yeah.
But it didn't really break the streak, okay? It just happened to not hit 100 that day. So what's the difference? 99 or 102? Really?
Well,
I mean,
so here's
but
go ahead.
I don't remember in 1980, when it was over, I don't remember anybody running around talking about global warming and climate change and all the political things we have today. I mean, think about that. It's never been like that again. And that was, do the math, 43 years ago.
A long time.
So I don't get the part about, oh, it's so hot. See, this summer is a little bit warm, yeah, but it's warm every summer. And they're making it out like this big heat wave is engulfing the country, and it's like something they want to blame it on climate change. Well, gosh, it's summertime. Does people realize that it's summer and it's Texas and
Well, and I don't know where this ranks on the list, but 2 years later, you're in your second year of being a resident of the great nation of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Remember all that incredible snow that we had that shut everything down for a week? I don't know how many feet it was, but I've never seen anything like that. That was when I lived growing up in Waco.
Yeah, that was 83. But
Was that 83?
yeah.
I thought that was 82.
No, 83. But yeah, and it was down below zero for a number of days, and pipes were frozen, and water mains were breaking all over when it started to thaw out, and it was so cold for so long. But gosh, I know it's hot, and I'm not saying it's not hot. I know it is. Take care of yourself. Hydrate. Don't overdo it, But, we've seen this before. This is nothing new.
I was thinking about you as I was heading back from lunch, and I noticed on my gasoline gauge that I had 10 miles left. And I got to thinking, before I ran out of gas, I wonder what Tony Joe would say the practical thing to do here, because if it said 15 or 20, I'd still pull over for gas. I wouldn't chance it. But at what point does a car really run out of gas? Because now I've been in that situation maybe 3 times total in my life, because I'm usually really good about not being in that situation. But the last time it happened to me, it went from 8, and then all of a sudden it disappeared. It was pretty frightening.
Right. Well, let me tell you that years ago, I remember in the 80s, Honda was the first one that started this trend. They use a little more reserve after the E than you think. And the reason for that was because when they used to say E, it was empty.
It was empty.
And then they don't want, manufacturers don't want to see their cars on the side of the road all over Dallas.
Right.
So you probably have more. But, Bob, let's talk about one thing real quick. Even though you made it to the gas station, when the tank, the fuel pump is cooled by fuel in the tank. That's actually what keeps it being submerged in fuel is what keeps it cool. It's an electric motor, and it will get warm. It generates heat. It gets warm. And if you don't have enough fuel, especially when you go around corners and things like that, there is a built-in sump for it, but keeping the fuel pump covered prolongs its life. You can go the whole life of a car, never need a fuel pump. But people that run it down to empty or quarter of a tank or less and tend to live on that edge of the border.
You mean my wife?
Tend to have more problems with fuel pumps. And the reason is simple. It's because you're not keeping it cool enough. And that ends up, shortening the life of the pump. And then you got to have a pump, and they're pretty expensive now. So just a word to the,
Well, I don't do it all the time.
No, I know.
I just
but
do it. It just happens.
It's not a good practice for anybody.
So tell me, Tony Joe, you started talking about this last week. We ran into the dreaded end of the program, so you didn't really get to completely close your thoughts on it. But I want to go back to this just real quick, not take a whole lot of time on it, but what you do when your car overheats, because this, once again, is a piece of advice that people wouldn't expect.
Okay. Let me start off by saying that most engines today in most vehicles are made of aluminum parts, okay? Aluminum cylinder heads, aluminum cylinder blocks, even aluminum heads and cast iron blocks are a mismatch when it comes to the amount of expansion and contraction being equal to both dissimilar metals. So why am I starting off with this? Well, it's because the car is designed to run at a certain temperature. And when you exceed that temperature, the aluminum expansion rate is going to be significantly higher than that of the cast iron in the engine. So you get this kind of mismatch, and the gaskets can tend to leak, and the cylinder head can crack, and then you're gotta basically looking at a new engine. And this is why it's important not to let the vehicle overheat. So if the vehicle is starting to get hot and heading for that red zone, as much as you're not going to want to hear this, the most effective thing you can do at that point, the most effective thing you can do is pull over and stop and get it towed, okay?
Right.
But if you can't do that and you're in a bad situation and you got to get somewhere a little further, maybe you're in a spot where you can't pull over and you need to get to a place where you can, what you do is you roll the windows down, turn on the heater, full blast, turn it all the way to hot, turn the blower on high. The idea is to dissipate some of that engine heat that the radiator and the cooling system can't handle. Get it going through the heater, and the blower motor will blow it out through the passenger compartment and dissipate a lot of heat that way. So that is nothing more than buying you time. It's not going to fix anything. If you keep driving, the car is eventually going to overheat. But if you can do that, as uncomfortable as it may seem, that may get you to a place, home, or get you to a place that you can safely pull over or park or get some help or get to a garage or whatever the situation. The thing you don't want to do is get that needle up into the red. When it pegs all the way up into the red, that's when it could cost you a significant amount of money. So keep that in mind as an emergency procedure, just in case it ever happens to you. Some of the things that we tell people is, you're driving in the city, and all of a sudden your air conditioner doesn't seem cold anymore. Well, that should alert you automatically. Get those eyes pegged right on that temperature gauge. See if your car is starting to get hot. One of the things that happens is the cooling fans can quit working. The first thing you're going to notice is your air conditioner is not going to get cold. Then that should tell you, something's wrong. I mean, you should be looking at your gauges anyway, but if you're not a person that knows how to read the gauges, learn how to read the gauges because they're very simple to read, but you need to be able to detect when something is headed your way before it's too late and the car is overheating, steaming out the hood. You can't go anymore. The engine stops running. Now you're pretty much faced in these days and times with what metals they're using now. You're going to need a new engine.
Well, and something else to add to what you're saying, I think that you've said this before, and it's important, is to look at your gauges when everything's running right.
So you
know what looks normal.
Right. So you'll have a reference to
Right.
compare it to. And, when you think about it, Bob, it's common sense that the gauge goes from, let's just take one gauge, cold and hot, the temperature gauge. Well, if you got a gauge and you're going to put it in the car, and the car's supposed to run at 210 degrees, and you're going to look at a gauge and it's going to have cold and hot, the most accurate portion of that gauge is going to be roughly halfway. So basically, the gauges should be in the middle. I know it sounds simplistic, but if you think about how a gauge is built, what would you do? You'd want to have a little room to go cooler than normal and a little more room to go warmer than normal. So the normal reading is going to be right about in the middle of the gauge.
This is Bob Brooks, 1-877-913-5357. This is you're listening to Special Car Corner Edition. We'll be right back.
The Word for Today is excited to announce the new official online home for the ministry of Pastor Chuck Smith and Kay Smith, pastorchuck.org. At pastorchuck.org, you'll have instant access to thousands of hours of verse-by-verse teaching by Pastor Chuck Smith from Genesis through Revelation, and full access to special messages on subjects such as prophecy and much, much more. Also at pastorchuck.org, a full library of great teachings by Kay Smith, and a section where you can read some of Pastor Chuck's books online, all free of charge. So visit the new official online home of the Word for Today and the ministry of Pastor Chuck and Kay Smith, pastorchuck.org.
Jesus Christ is coming back, and he's coming back soon. But sometimes we lose sight of this bigger picture and focus instead on the routines and busyness of life. I'm John Monroe, and Monday on The Verdict, we're preparing our hearts and minds for the magnificent return of Christ. Join us in Revelation, Monday on The Verdict.
The Verdict, weekday mornings at 10:30, here on Bible School Radio, KDKR.
Soldiers going into battle expect to get bloodied and bruised. They aren't surprised when the enemy attacks. So why are Christians so easily caught off guard when the enemies of the gospel push back? Monday on Focal Point, Pastor Mike Fabarez prepares Christians for the inevitable opposition they face as they proclaim the gospel. Hear more Monday on Focal Point.
Focal Point, weekday mornings at 8:30, here on Bible School Radio, KDKR.
This is Bob Brooks, and welcome to the special Car Corner edition of Prudent Money. Well, Tony Joe, we were talking about overheating of a car, what to look out for, and you're talking about the gauges. Get a little bit more into detail about what you're looking for, and I got to thinking about something, and how you can teach your kids that are just starting to drive how to read gauges. Because I got to tell you, I was just thinking about that. I don't really know that neither one of my boys really understand if this were to happen. Then, in fact, I remember being in high school and the car I was driving started overheating, and I didn't call my dad. There's no way I called my dad. Anyway, never mind. That was something else. But talk a little bit about how to effectively read the gauges.
All right. Well, if you really take note sometime when you have time, this is going to be something where you've got 20 minutes with nothing to do, and you're going to think your life is pathetic, but you're going to go outside and look at the dashboard. You can turn the key on. Some of the gauges will move, some won't. But the important thing to know is that when you look at a gauge, I know we're beating this to death, but let's take the cooling temperature gauge because we were just discussing that. When you see the gauge, it'll have a C and an H on it, but it will also have a scale on it. And that scale, usually, in most cases, will have a white mark after the C and a white mark before the H. After that white mark on the H, it goes to a red zone. Now, as you're looking at the gauge, the white mark is the lowest available temperature that the car ever wants to see. Because cars can run too cool, Bob. Thermostats, things like that. Cars can run cooler than they have to, which causes additional problems for other things. But for our discussion right now, you look at the gauge, you're going to have a white mark after the C. That's the lowest point that the car can run at. You will have a white mark somewhere before the H. You'll have another white mark. And usually there's a connecting line between these two marks. Well, that's what we call the normal operating range. It's a range. You can go anywhere from there to there. I mean, it's still okay with the car if that needle is anywhere in that normal, whited out, zoned area. However, when you get up to the red always means emergency, just like anything else. Red stoplights, red emergencies, everything. So you get up to the red, you want to make sure somehow you either do our little procedure to get somewhere or you shut the car off and park it. Because whatever's causing it to get that hot, you don't want to aggravate an already bad situation. You could cost yourself, tens of thousands of dollars, or at least $10,000, depending on what kind of a vehicle you're driving. Basically what I'm saying is a new engine. So you don't want to do that. So keep it out of the red zone. Now, other gauges, such as the oil pressure and the alternator and some other things like, let's just take, for instance, the charging system or the alternator or the battery gauge, as some refer to it. Well, not all cars have a gauge for the battery, but a lot of them do. And when you look at it, simple little thing I used to teach my kids is turn the key on. We know the car has a 12-volt battery. That's common knowledge to most people. So when you turn the key on but don't start it, wherever that needle goes to that gauge means 12 volts. Now, sometimes it's not exactly at 12 because those gauges are not high dollar gauges. They're not really high quality, but they're pretty good for practical purposes. So you turn the key on and you're initiating voltage from the 12-volt battery to the gauge. And what should the gauge read? Well, wherever that needle points is pretty much 12 volts. Then when you hit the key to start the car, you want to look at that needle because once the car is running, you are now charging the battery from the alternator, which should make that needle rise. And it should rise to approximately 14. 14 volts is about the normal charging range. So what you're looking for, Bob, is not so much the numbers on the gauge to be as accurate as you'd like them to be, because sometimes the gauge doesn't even have any numbers. But what you're looking for is the reaction of the gauge. That is to say, when it's on and not running, that needle points to a certain spot. Once you start the car, that needle should go up higher than that point. Doesn't matter how much higher, doesn't matter where it goes, but these are things that you need to know because someday you may be driving your car and all of a sudden the blinkers don't work right or some electrical features aren't working right and you're thinking, well, what could be wrong? And you look down and you find out that your alternator is no longer charging. It has gone from the higher point back down to 12 volts, which means you better get somewhere, shut that car up because you're running only on the battery.
Yeah, very important to know and exactly what those gauges mean. So let's take a scenario that you're obviously not going to be able to answer this straight up because it's a very complex answer, a complex process.
Okay.
You find yourself in the situation where your car is overheating, and the obvious is you would want to easily pull it into a place you can get it there and you're safe and everything works out. But let's say that you're not there quite yet. How do you know? I mean, what's the decision point that, man, if I don't shut this down, we're going to have real problems versus, yeah, I can push it just a little bit?
Okay, good question. That the key right there is to suffer with the heater on procedure as we described and keep your eye on the temperature gauge. You cannot get it in the red. Once it's in the red, you're costing yourself a ton of money, probably. So how far can you push it? As long as you keep your eye on that gauge and it doesn't get to the red, it can get 1 millimeter hair thickness before the red, and it's still okay. But once it gets into the red, time to pull over.
So that's
no matter what.
It's
time
no
to
matter
get it
what.
Up. Right. Unless you're prepared to, spend a lot of money.
And you see that pretty standard on all
Yes.
automobiles.
I do. It's pretty standard on all cars. That gauge is so important. It's so very important to keep your eye on the gauges. And most people drive. I mean, some, their dads taught them to watch the gauges and some didn't. So I always try to compel people to, you're driving on a long trip, you're going to Austin or San Antonio or something, you need to kind of glance down at your gauges every now and then. Barring the fuel gauge, because it depends on how much gas you put in it, most people are going to fill it up before they leave. All the other gauges should be relatively in the middle.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the special Car Corner edition of Prudent Money. Tony Joe's with me today, as he is every Friday, to take your Car Corner questions, 1-877-913-5357. So you and I were talking about this, and we narrowed it down to 3 different symptoms, warning signs. Hey, you got a problem. You might want to check into this. The first one is that the car stops blowing cold air and same force, the air's coming out, but it's all hot. What's going on there, and what should you be looking for?
Well, that could be a multitude of things, but if the air is blowing hot, but it's blowing, that means the blower motor is okay. Electrically, things are probably okay, but either the compressor shut off for some reason, or you broke a belt and you're no longer driving the compressor, or possibly you blew a hose or a line, or got a hole in the condenser, you lost the refrigerant somehow. And by the way, I just want to point out, it is not out of the realm of possibility that you're driving down the highway and a rock gets thrown up, and you know how it hits your windshield and cracks it?
Right.
Well, I've seen with the new condensers, they're so thin and they're making the metal thinner and thinner to get more efficiency out of them. But I've seen a lot more rock fractures in condensers than I've ever seen before. So a rock can fly in the front of your grill, just like it would, and hit your windshield, go into the condenser and crack it. And now all the refrigerant is going to come out, so your air conditioner is done. It's just going to get warmer and warmer until it's just blowing hot air.
The second one was the volume of air drops. What's going on?
Volume of air dropping due to the fact, more than likely, that the inside cabin filter, not the air filter for the engine, but the internal cabin filter, the air you breathe, that pollen filter can get clogged up, and when it does, the fan can't blow as much air as fast as it wants to, which reduces the volume coming out of your vents. And that filter can sometimes get plugged up and needs to be replaced.
Real quick, doesn't blow air at all.
Yeah, that's the problem with usually circuitry. Electrically, something is wrong. The blower motor does not get power, or the blower motor does not work. Resistors for the blower motor could be at fault. The switch, power from the fuse just took everything out. There's a whole multitude of things, but those are usually electrically in nature, electrical.
But I think it's safe to say the one thing you want to close this down on, everything could be working perfectly, and the next minute your engine's overheating. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it can happen pretty quick. If you were driving down the road and somebody shot through the front of your radiator, you got about maybe 7-8 minutes, and you're going to be in the red. So that kind of gives you a window to kind of compare it to.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the special Car Corner edition of Prudent Money. Listen, if you ever don't get to listen to the show, you can always go and pull up the podcast. We podcast on every major platform, and we usually post that program about 10-15 minutes after we get done. So you can go check that out at prudentmoney.com. If you've got a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.